Imagine the world in 2100, where there's a possibility of 8 degrees of warming, a temperature that would make even moving around outside in the tropics and around the equator impossible for humans without heat-related death. Ocean levels could rise more than 200 feet, which would flood two-thirds of the world's major cities. Most land would be unable to grow any of the types of food that we now eat. Forests would be almost continually on fire. We would see more and more intense hurricanes. Tropical diseases would be able to spread almost all the way to the Arctic. About one-third of the planet would be rendered inhabitable because of direct heat. Droughts and heat waves would be much harsher and more frequent. This is a possible future that is portrayed by The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming, by David Wallace Wells. Crown Publishing Group published the book on February 19, 2019. The Uninhabitable Earth starts by examining relevant scientific data and research about global warming. The book's first section is called Cascades, and focuses on current mainstream sentiments about climate change, and how many of these basic ideas that most people have about global warming are flawed, half-truths, or just misguided. Wallace Wells takes a hard look at the last decade of scientific findings and uses them to compare the average person's understanding of mechanisms of climate change versus the reality of the situation. Wallace Wells argues that, for the most part, even those who do believe in global warming tend to be very misinformed about it. For example, Wallace Wells points out that much of the discussion about the effects of climate change is focused on rising sea levels of the planet's oceans and seas. While there is no doubt that sea levels will rise, and this is something to be concerned about, this is only one of many, as Wallace Wells puts it, elements of chaos that will be direct effects of global warming. Another belief that the author attacks is global warming is a cumulative effect of all human activities since the Industrial Revolution. Although this is technically true, it is also a way for the world's current inhabitants to absolve themselves, or at least partially, of the blame. The reality is that more than half of all of the carbon emissions that have been released from the burning of fossil fuels have come from just the last 3 decades. Or in other words, more than half of our fossil fuel emissions have come in less than one generation. A generation is still around today. Wallace Wells claims that climate change, and exactly how, when, and to what extent humans react to it, will become the focal point that future historians will study about us. This is the most important idea from the first section of the book, that climate change is happening, and that humanity's course of action in the present will determine how disastrous the impacts will be in the future. There has already been much damage done, but how much more damage we will go on to do is still yet to be determined. Just in the last 40 years, over half of the world's vertebrates have died, and possibly 3/4 of the world's insects. Some bears have stopped hibernating annually. Species that took millions of years to individuate themselves into distinct species are being pushed closer together because of changing climate, which is causing interspecies breeding and hybridization. The effects of climate change are by nature slow, but faster than the topic is normally portrayed in popular discourse. Even if we managed to eliminate all emissions right now, we would still see additional warming from the carbon that we have already emitted into the atmosphere, by some estimates, at least half a degree more. This is where the main tenet of the uninhabitable Earth shows through, that we must do everything humanly possible to reach zero emissions as soon as we can, because what we do right now will limit not only the future habitability of the planet, but also will limit the choices that we have for fighting the changes that are sure to come in the future. The scientific community is as close to unanimous as possible. The reckless burning of fossil fuels has put the future of our planet, and therefore human existence, into question. The thought that we can put into place mechanisms that will avert the effects of climate change is more or less a fairy tale. There will be changes to the world's weathers, oceans, and soil. That is already known. What is not known is exactly how bad it will get, because this is dependent on the decisions that are made today. These are just some of the elements of chaos that Wallace Wells goes on to explore throughout the book. He puts forward 12 distinct elements in the second section of the book. Heat death, hunger, which is about famine, drowning, which is about sea level rise, wildfire, disasters no longer natural, which is about changing weather systems, freshwater drain, which is about the loss of land that absorbs excess water, dying oceans, unbreathable air, plagues of warming, economic collapse, climate conflict, and systems, the final chapter, which Wallace Wells details how none of the threats that we face from climate change will occur independently, but will build on each other, making the cumulative impacts much greater and much more difficult to manage. For example, more wildfires will lead to increased chance of mudslide. Wallace Wells wrote this book to invoke panic, in the hope that maybe it would shake us out of complacency. This is clear from the start. The book begins with a line, "It's worse, much worse than you think." The book is supposed to be alarming. The second section of the book methodically lays out what seems like an endless stream of scientific statistics, all which paint a horrific picture of how climate change will come to impact every aspect of the world we know. The author also sets out to make it clear that we have known for quite a long time that human activities were causing climate change. But just as in the present, it didn't lead to any meaningful changes in human behavior or governmental policy. We have burned more fossil fuels since the UN established the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change than in all of the centuries before. So we have done more damage knowingly than we ever managed in ignorance. That is a horrifying fact. It also means we are engineering our own devastation practically in real time. While the author's approach and probable intentions in this regard are intuitive, breaching the topic in this way can unfortunately cause the opposite effect. A reader can easily become worn out and complacent after reading something as alarming as this. It can create a feeling of powerlessness, or even apathy, which will make it inherently difficult to make the changes that are needed to prevent the worst-case scenarios. The starkness of the author's approach could quite possibly lead to an outcome that is exactly the opposite of his intentions. Another critique that can be made of the author is his occasionally overly anthropocentric view of the world. This can be seen quite clearly from one instance in the first section of the book. Wallace Wells writes that, "I may be in the minority in feeling that the world could lose much of what we think of as nature. As far as I cared, so long as we can go on living as we have in the world left behind. The problem is we can't." Wallace Wells goes on to the offensive very early in the book, pointing out major fables that we have about global warming. The first is that climate change is incredibly slow, a process that will only see changes happening in the distant future. The author writes that we are now speeding blindly on a course to more than 4 degrees of warming by the year 2100, having brought the planet to the brink of catastrophe with the lifetime of a single generation. This is an important myth to debunk, as thinking of climate change with this attitude gives us the false belief that we have ample time to find meaningful solutions, which unfortunately we do not. Writing directly to his intended audience, Western nationals, he also addresses the false belief that climate change is an isolated problem. It won't just affect the Arctic or faraway lands. It will affect everyone, everywhere. Climate change won't just mean melted ice in the Arctic and flooded coastal cities in Bangladesh. It means starvation, droughts, disease, refugee crises, and war. Even now, when we are only seeing around 1 degree of warming, the world is already experiencing unprecedented onslaught of extreme weather catastrophes and rates of extinction in animal populations that register as a major extinction event. What's important to remember about this is that the effects of climate change will only go forward. What is being seen across the world today is better than the best-case scenario for the future. The author's in-depth look at carbon capture technology, something I had much optimism for, was well written and illuminating. He breaks down the feasibility of harnessing carbon capture technology as an effective tool to fight global warming. According to the writer, at present, we shouldn't get our hopes up. The technology does exist today, but it's not as efficient as it needs to be to make a meaningful difference, and is currently too expensive to employ on a mass scale. It's clearly visible that the author recommends abandoning the idea that carbon capture technology could be a viable apparatus to combat excess carbon in the atmosphere. Not to say that one day it couldn't be a useful tool, but for right now, the technology simply isn't ready, which just isn't feasible, as the writer writes. Winning slowly is the same thing as losing. If we don't act quickly and on a global scale, the problem will literally become insoluble. The decisions we make in 2075 won't matter. The Uninhabitable Earth is a book that can, overall, be easily recommended. The arguments put forward by Wallace Wells are interesting and, for the most part, supported thoroughly by relevant scientific statistics and analysis. Overall, the book reinforced my views on the topic, that tackling climate change aggressively is of the utmost importance. Every second we wait to take meaningful action against global warming is effectively passing the metaphorical baton off to the next generation. a baton that gets heavier and heavier each second, and on a course that accumulates more obstacles that are harder to overcome.